A man is lying on his side on a couch, propped up on one elbow, because in ancient Rome only barbarians and small children sat upright to eat. Behind him stands a slave holding two things, a basin and a feather. Our man has already worked his way through a roast peacock, the tongues of roughly 100 flamingos, and something that used to be a pig, and now has a name in Latin. He is not finished. He is nowhere close to finished. So he reaches for that feather, leans toward the basin, and, well, you know how the story goes. He empties himself out, dabs his mouth, and strolls back to the table for round two. And somewhere in that mansion, supposedly, there is a special little room built for this exact purpose, a room for throwing up, the vomitorium. It is one of the most famous facts about ancient Rome. It is in textbooks. It is in documentaries. Your history teacher probably told you with a little smirk on their face, and almost every single piece of it is wrong. Here is what is actually going on, because honestly, the truth is so much stranger than the myth. Number 1. Yes, some Romans genuinely did throw up at dinner on purpose, but the reason has nothing to do with the story you were sold. And one of those reasons is going to sound suspiciously like a wellness trend you scrolled past on your phone last week. Number 2, the vomitorium was real. It existed. You could walk through one. It simply had nothing, and I mean nothing whatsoever, to do with vomiting. And once you learn what it actually was, you will never look at a packed stadium the same way again. And number 3, there was one Roman emperor so devoted to eating that even other Romans found him revolting, which, trust me, is an Olympic-level achievement, and his story ends with a feather, a murder, and a serving dish named after a goddess. So stay with me, because by the end of this, you are going to understand exactly why this myth refuses to die. And I promise you, the whole thing traces back to a single sentence somebody scribbled 2,000 years ago, plus one word that everybody, including some genuinely brilliant historians, managed to read completely wrong. Let's go to dinner, Roman dinner. First thing you need to understand is that for a wealthy Roman, dinner was not about being hungry. Dinner was a performance. They called the whole event a convivium, literally a living together. And it was the single most important way a rich man showed the world who he was. You did not eat at a table and chair like a peasant. You reclined. You stretched out on cushioned couches arranged in a U shape, 3 guests to a couch, 9 being the perfect number for a party, leaning on your left elbow and eating with your right hand, which, if you have ever tried to eat lying down, you will know is a genuinely insane way to consume soup. Around you, slaves moved like a silent stage crew. Some carried in platters from the kitchen. Others played the lyre, or sang, or danced. The food came in waves, course after course, starting with eggs and olives and little salty things to wake up the palate, building toward roasted meats, and finishing with sweets. And the menu was designed to make your guests gasp. The Roman novelist Petronius wrote a famous satire about this, a fictional dinner thrown by a tacky, newly rich host named Trimalchio, and one of the dishes he serves is dormice, little fattened mice, glazed in honey, and rolled in poppy seeds, mice, for dessert, basically, as a flex. So already, before anyone has thrown up anything, you can see the real picture forming. This was a culture where eating was about status, excess, and showing off, which is the perfect breeding ground for the next part, because yes, the throwing up was real. Some Romans really did do it. Our best witness is a philosopher named Seneca, and here is where this entire myth is secretly born, so pay attention. Seneca was a Stoic, which roughly means he believed the good life was about self-control and not being a slave to your appetites, and he absolutely could not stand the gluttony of the Roman elite. In one of his works, he writes a line so sharp it has echoed for 2,000 years. He says these people vomit so that they may eat, and eat so that they may vomit. Vomit to eat to vomit. Now, read that again, because this is the moment the whole legend takes a wrong turn. Seneca was not writing an instruction manual. He was not a food blogger giving you tips. He was disgusted. That line was an insult. It was him pointing at the richest people in Rome and saying, "Look at these animals. They have turned their own bodies into a revolving door for luxury." It was moral outrage dressed up as a one-liner. But here is the thing about a really good one-liner. It survives. It gets repeated. And somewhere along the centuries, people stopped hearing the disgust and started hearing it as a description of normal Roman behavior. The insult became a fun fact, but gluttony is only half of it, and here is where it gets genuinely surprising. Because for some Romans, throwing up was not about greed at all. It was about health. Stay with me here. There was a Roman writer named Celsus who put together a kind of medical encyclopedia, and in it he talks about vomiting as a treatment, a wellness practice. The idea was that purging your stomach cleared out bad stuff, balanced you, kept you in shape. Now, to his credit, Celsus actually warns against overdoing it. He basically says, look, if you want to stay healthy and live to old age, do not make this a daily habit. That is what the gluttons do. But the core belief was there in the culture. Vomiting could be good for you. And this was not some fringe idea. Julius Caesar himself, the Julius Caesar, reportedly took emetics, which are substances that make you throw up, and according to a speech by Cicero, Caesar once expressed a desire to vomit after dinner and used a treatment to do exactly that. So picture that for a second. The most powerful man in the Roman world, conqueror of Gaul, the guy on the salad, deliberately making himself sick after dinner because he thought it was good for his digestion. If that sounds completely unhinged, I want you to remember the last time the internet told you to drink celery juice on an empty stomach, or do a 3-day cleanse, or that your body needs to detox. The Romans were doing ancient biohacking. They were 2,000 years early to the wellness influencer game. They just skipped the smoothie and went straight to the basin. Okay, so we have gluttony and we have weird medical theories. Now let me introduce you to the men who took both of these to a level that horrified an entire empire. Because if vomiting at dinner was a sport, these two were the all-stars. Start with the Emperor Claudius. You might know him as the stammering, limping, supposedly bumbling emperor who turned out to be smarter than everyone expected. Well, the historian Suetonius gives us a less flattering detail. He tells us that Claudius would basically never leave the dining room until he was completely stuffed and soaked in wine, and then he would flop onto his back to sleep, mouth hanging open, and someone would slide a feather down his throat to make him bring it all back up and relieve his overloaded stomach. There it is, the feather, the image you started this video with. It was real for at least one emperor. But here is the dark little twist, because the feather comes back. When Claudius died, the rumor mill went into overdrive, and one version of his death says he was poisoned, and that when the first dose of poison did not finish the job, a doctor finished him off with a feather. A poisoned feather slipped down his throat under the pretense of helping him vomit, the way he always did after dinner. We do not know if that is true. But think about how grim that is. His most disgusting habit may have become the murder weapon. The feather that emptied his stomach for years may have been the thing that emptied his life. And yet, Claudius is not even the champion, not even close. That title goes to a man named Vitellius. Vitellius was emperor for only a few months in the chaotic year 69, the year Rome burned through 4 emperors, like a streaming service burns through CEOs. And in that short time, he built a reputation for eating that the Romans never forgot. Suetonius tells us he ate 3, sometimes 4 full banquets a day: breakfast, lunch, dinner, and then a drinking party on top. And the reason he could physically survive this, supposedly, was that he kept taking emetics between meals, throwing up to reset, so he could keep going. Each one of these feasts cost a fortune. We are talking sums of money that could have fed a small town. And then there is his masterpiece, a dish so legendary it had a name. He called it the Shield of Minerva, after the goddess, and it was an enormous platter piled with the most absurdly expensive ingredients in the known world: the livers of pikefish, the brains of pheasants and peacocks, the tongues of flamingos, the insides of lampreys, which are these horrifying eel-like creatures. And the ingredients were so rare that Vitellius reportedly sent warships across the sea, from one edge of the empire to the other, just to gather them. He used the imperial navy as a grocery delivery service. Now, you are probably building a very clear picture of this guy in your head right now. The gross one, the cartoon glutton, the villain. And this is where I have to stop you, because here comes the first real plot twist of this story. Modern historians have gone back and looked hard at these accounts, and a lot of them are now deeply suspicious. Because here is the inconvenient fact: almost everything we know about Vitellius comes from writers who hated him, who were on the side of the people who overthrew him. He lost. The winners wrote his story. And in Roman politics, accusing your dead rival of being a gluttonous, vomiting, money-burning pig was a classic move. It was propaganda. Some scholars now argue that the shield of Minerva was not even mindless gluttony at all, but a clever, almost artistic dish, with ingredients chosen for symbolism and meaning, and that the whole revolting image of Vitellius was cranked up to make him look unfit to rule. In other words, the most disgusting eater in Roman history might partly be a smear campaign, which honestly makes him more interesting, not less. So let me ask you something right here, at the exact halfway point of this story. When I started, you probably pictured a tidy little marble room with a basin, where Romans calmly went to purge between courses. If that is the image you had in your head, I want you to know you are in extremely good company, because that same mistake fooled scholars, novelists, and teachers for over 100 years. And if you find this kind of thing fascinating, where the famous version of history turns out to be a beautiful misunderstanding, then do yourself a favor and subscribe right now, because what I am about to tell you next is the part that actually breaks the whole myth open. This is the reveal everything has been building to. Because we still have not answered the big question. If the vomitorium was real, and it was, then what on earth was it? Here is the answer. A vomitorium was a doorway, a passage, an exit ramp. That is it. That is the big secret. In a Roman amphitheater, like the Colosseum, you had tens of thousands of people who all needed to get to their seats, and more importantly, get out again without trampling each other into paste. So Roman engineers, who were genuinely brilliant at this stuff, built a network of wide passageways and tunnels beneath and behind the seating that fed the crowds in and spat them back out. Those passages were called vomitoria, and the name comes from the Latin word vomere, which means to spew forth, to disgorge, to pour out. The vomitorium did not throw up food, it threw up people. A flood of human beings pouring out into the streets after the show. And the Colosseum was the masterpiece of this design. It had dozens of these vomitoria, and the system worked so well that historians estimate the entire crowd, something like 50,000 people, could empty out of the building in just a few minutes. Think about that the next time you spend 45 minutes stuck in a parking lot after a concert. A 2,000-year-old stadium could clear out faster than your local arena. The Romans solved crowd flow better than we have, and the word they used for it is the exact same word everyone now thinks means a puke closet. So how did we get it so wrong? How did a clever piece of architecture become a barf room? This is the final piece, and it is gloriously human. The word vomitorium, used for those exits, only shows up clearly in one ancient source, a writer named Macrobius, all the way back in the 5th century. And then, for a long time, it just sat there. The trouble started much, much later. The Oxford English Dictionary traces the modern misunderstanding, the idea of a special room for vomiting, to the writer Aldous Huxley in a novel from 1923. Somewhere in that stretch, somebody saw the word vomitorium, saw that root, vomit, connected it to those old stories about Romans throwing up at feasts, the ones Seneca was complaining about, and just put 2 and 2 together to get 5. The vomit room was born, not in ancient Rome, in the modern imagination, and once that idea existed, it was unstoppable, because it is just such a good story. It is the perfect little package of everything we want to believe about Rome. Decadence, excess, an empire so spoiled it built dedicated architecture for gluttony. It feels true, it is too vivid to give up. So it spread into books, into classrooms, into trivia nights, a perfect myth, passed mouth to mouth for a century, like a game of telephone that started with a philosopher's insult and ended with a marble room that never existed. So, why did Romans throw up during their feasts? Now you actually know, and the real answer has 3 layers. First, a tiny sliver of the super rich genuinely did it out of pure gluttony, gorging and purging to keep the party going, exactly the people Seneca was pointing at in disgust. Second, plenty of Romans threw up because they sincerely believed it was healthy, a medical purge, ancient wellness culture, the celery juice of the 1st century. And third, and this is the big one, the whole thing got burned into history not because it was common, but because the people who wrote about it were horrified by it. Moralists like Seneca turned Roman vomiting into a symbol, a glittering example of an empire rotting from too much luxury. They made it memorable on purpose, and memorable things survive. The vomitorium room was never real. There was no marble chamber with a basin and a fresh supply of feathers. There was a brilliant stadium exit, a quotable insult from an angry philosopher, a couple of genuinely revolting emperors, and 2,000 years of people slowly mishearing the story until the myth was tastier than the truth. And maybe that is the part worth chewing on. The Romans did not build a monument to their own gluttony. We built it for them, out of one word and one good line, because deep down we love the idea of a civilization that ate itself sick. The vomitorium says less about Rome than it does about us, and what we want history to be. So here is what I will leave you with. You now understand the vomitorium better than basically everyone you know, which means the next time someone at a dinner brings it up as a fun fact, you get to be the most insufferable person at the table, and I mean that as the highest compliment. If you enjoyed having a myth taken apart like this, there is a whole pile of history that is secretly fake in exactly the same way, and I am working through all of it. Subscribe and come find out which famous fact falls next. Just maybe finish your meal first.